The topic that we digressed from for a number of weeks, and these are the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. Some of you might dread it, some of you might like it, but every part of Torah, I assume that most of you were probably at the Levaya yesterday. So when we think about Rav Chaim Kanievsky's Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the Sar HaTorah, the Gadol Hador, a person whose knowledge of Torah is really unparalleled in many, many generations. So one of the things we have to think about is the idea that one has to try to know every part of Torah, every single part of Torah. One should try to know that even though it's true, that in order to encourage us to learn, we should learn Mashal Libo Chafetz, the things that attract us, that gives us enthusiasm. But you must build on that enthusiasm to try to look at every chelik of Torah, just as Rav Chaim was sholeit in every single chelik of Torah. You may have heard the famous story. So it's a famous story, and it might even be true. I'm not going to say for sure it's true. That Rav Chaim wanted to examine the status of what makes certain grasshoppers kosher, because there is a halacha, Teimanim eat certain grasshoppers, because the Torah itself says certain chagavim are kosher. And they have a Messiah. Ashkenazim don't have a Messiah, and the whole machlekes, can an Ashkenazi eat something that has a Messiah of Svardim? Because after all, they have a Messiah, but that's a machlekes. Ask your local rabbi if you're allowed to eat chagavim, whatever. I'm not sure if you'd want to eat them, but there may be a possibility. Svardim indeed can eat them. But Rav Chaim was going through the sugya, and he couldn't really identify b'diyuk what the signs were based on the Gemara and the Rishonim, because it's hard sometimes to figure it out. So Rav Chaim, looked at his children's biology books, pictures of insects, whatever, to try to figure out, and it didn't fit the Rishonim, it didn't fit the Gemara. So one day he's learning, and a grasshopper just all of a sudden appears on his table. And normally, you try to pick up a grasshopper, it's going to jump away, but this grasshopper was a very passive grasshopper. He was able to pick it up, he was able to examine it very carefully, to understand exactly what the simanim were, and as soon as he figured it out and he put it down, the grasshopper flew away. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him a grasshopper, so he could be baidek the simanim. So this story was told in some group, and there was a certain Talmud Chacham, who said, Rav Chaim is very great, but I don't believe that story. He says, I don't believe that story at all. He says, people make up stories. So what happened was, all of a sudden his house got invaded with grasshoppers. Like Arba, huh?
That person or Rav Chaim?
No, not that person,
okay.
That person. Because he questioned that Hashem would cause grasshoppers to come to Rav Chaim, so his house is inundated with grasshoppers. And he calls in exterminators. He didn't attribute it to this. He calls in exterminators, and they exterminate, and the grasshoppers keep on coming back and back. They're like invulnerable, like nothing happens to them, and he's inundated. And then finally, he's telling somebody, I don't know what's going on with grasshoppers. So somebody who knew this, what he said before, he says, do you remember what you said about Rav Chaim, that you didn't believe a grasshopper would come? He said, yeah. He says, you better ask Rav Chaim Mechila. Ask Mechila for Rav Chaim. So he went to Rav Chaim, and Rav Chaim said, yeah, I'm mochel, of course I'm mochel. And then the grasshoppers left. They left. Anyway, the story goes, though, that the man moved, not because of the grasshoppers, he eventually moved. And in his new house, like one grasshopper shows up to kind of remind him, remember that Maisa, whatever it is. Be careful in how you talk. Rav Chaim himself, people like to tell miracle stories. Rav Chaim himself was not machshiv miracle stories, and indeed that was not the Litvish tradition, even by the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon also, at Kal V'chomer, the Vilna Gaon had many, many miraculous stories. But the Gedolim said that the main thing you learn from the Vilna Gaon is not miracles, not stories. The main thing you learn is about connection to Torah and learning Torah with devotion. And Rav Chaim would not be honored, he would not particularly get a lot of pleasure with our telling miracle stories about him, although there are indeed such stories. But to look at him as a role model of how one should be davuk in Torah, that's something that we can learn from. And and one way of looking at it is, that, I'll make up a number, it doesn't make any sense, that, his presence in the world, let's say, I'll make up a number, was 10 billion gallons of Kedusha. Now, he died, so the world is missing 10 billion gallons of Kedusha that was here. There's such a void, there is such an emptiness. So what do you do when there's a void or an emptiness? We have to fill it up. Now, none of us can put in 10 billion gallons of Kedusha. We're not on that much rega. But if enough people do a little bit more, you make up the 10 billion that you're missing. So this is the achrayus. When a great Gaon and tzaddik leaves the world, we all have to step up a little bit to be mashlim, to complete the chisaron that his absence has generated in the world. Okay, and that's really more important than, again, the stories might give us chizuk, etc. But the point is not so much the stories. The point is the learning and the righteousness, the yiras shamayim that was ever present, and those things we need to do. Okay, so really it's an achrayus. When we lose the great gedolim, every one of us has to become a little bit greater in our own lives, so we could somehow replenish the kedusha that has been taken from the world. So Yehi Zichrei Baruch again. There is really no one that can replace him, but we have to try anyway, right? When the Rabbi Chaim died, okay, Vilna Gaon died, also was the situation. You couldn't replace him, but we have to go on. That's the mission that Hashem has given us. Yeah.
I want to ask, at the funeral, does the way people act and change the aliyah of the neshama? Because some people were there around 10 saying to hit him, and it was really incredible, like how many people were there. Then there was also some people, and they just were getting to fight to the police, and it was like almost like.
They were doing what to the police? I didn't hear you.
There was fighting between like the.
Yeah.
Like that disrespectfulness, like change his aliyah neshama.
Well, I don't think it's going to change his aliyas neshama, but it certainly changes the hashpah that we gain. Being at a Levaya of a tzaddik, you get elevated, etc. And this type of misbehavior kind of cuts into the hashpah that we get. And not only the hashpah of the people who are involved in the misbehavior, but it even affects the other people who weren't. The whole experience gets changed. And that's very, very unfortunate. Now, as Levayas of Gedolim go, this happened to be actually a lot better than prior Levayas. Whether it's the police, whether it's the Zichron of Rav Chaim, whether it's a combination of all of those things, I don't know. But this was not as bad. There were Levayas where of great Gedolim where people were killed. So Baruch Hashem that this was not that type of situation. And but that too is a big bracha. There's a certain, you need certain zechusim, even that your funeral should not be gairim, anything unfortunate. So Rav Chaim had zechuyos in that way as well. I don't know how many of you ever had the zechus of meeting him. I'm sure it wasn't a long meeting, that's for sure, but at least being introduced to him, because we often bring JLE boys to Bnei Brak, and they get to meet Rav Chaim and get a bracha, whatever it is. But one doesn't know that he's very sweet, and he was very sweet in this way that he never wanted to embarrass people. So sometimes parents would bring in their kids and say, "My son learns Masechus Megillah. Can the Rav give him a test?" So Rav Chaim's questions are always pretty easy, and sometimes even when he asked an easy question, like the kid didn't know or the kid got confused, and so I think Rav Chaim asked him something that was in Maseches Megillah, and the kid didn't know. So Rav Chaim said, "Oh, it must be my mistake. Maybe it's in Maseches Shabbos. It's in both places." But he said, "It's my mistake. It was Maseches Shabbos. I got confused for a moment." And he asked the kid 5 questions. The kid didn't know any one of them, or maybe he was confused. So Rav Chaim finally asked a really, really easy question, what day in Adar is Purim or something, and the kid knew that. So Rav Chaim said, you know Megillah very well. He gave him a candy, whatever it is. So he actually said on himself that he never was he was never a Rosh Hashiva, he was never a Rosh Kollel, he was never a Rebbe. He never gave a shir. He said he was a Rebbe for exactly one day. He at one point in his career, He was a Rebbe to high school students. And he lasted only one day because, kids like to leave the class sometimes and walk around. I mean, I remember myself, go out for a bathroom break for 45 minutes and the like. And people kept on leaving. And finally, Rav Chaim says, Rav Chaim tells the story himself, he's left with one Talmud. He says to the Talmud, he says, do you need to go to the bathroom? He says, yeah. So Rav Chaim spent most of the time just learning by himself, and he realized that he's too nice, so to speak. In other words, especially with high school kids, and actually with older kids sometimes too, you got to be a disciplinarian, you got to be tough. And Batsheva was not. He was such a soft person. He could not, impose discipline on Talmidim. So part of why he answered any question anybody asked him, anything, is that he felt that he had a chiyuv to be marbitz Torah, and most marbitzei Torah do so in the way of teaching a shir. He says that wasn't his tafkid, so he had to be marbitz Torah by answering shailas and by writing svarim that people could learn. And he felt that this was the fulfillment of his obligation to try to spread Torah. His own father told him, it's interesting, his own father told him that he should not be a Rebbe, should not be a Rosh Yeshiva, should not be a Rosh Kollel. He should devote his life to learning and then to writing svarim. So his father told him not to take any positions. So that's interesting. So he really was, it's kind of unique. Actually, Rabbi Yosef was kind of the same way, that you have a Gadol Hador who's not has no official position. What was Rabbi Yosef's position? I mean, Rabbi Yosef had been a dayan for the Rabbanut years and years and years before, but the last 30 years of his life, he had no position at all. He was just Rabbi Yosef, right? And of course, that's Rav Chaim's father-in-law, and Rav Chaim was very much the same way. He had no position. Of course, the Vilna Gaon had no position either. Actually, the Chazon Ish had no position. So, actually there are kama v'kama gedolim who, their godless is not connected to a particular position that they have. They're not a Rav, they're not a Rosh Yeshiva, they're not a Rosh Kollel, they don't head any institution, but they're kind of above every institution, right? So they're not makusha to any particular place and the like. So, as I say, Rav Chaim's life should inspire us. I mean, you know what? You know this before. I mean, you know what he would learn every year, every single year. Babli, Yerushalmi, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, Torah, Medrash, Zohar, and Tanakh as well. And this was every year, every single year. And this was in addition to the Sfarim that he wrote, and in addition to the hundreds of people that he saw every day. So officially, his learning Kol HaTorah Kula was supposed to be squeezed into a 4-hour learning session. So these were the things he did in 4 or 5 hours, and the rest of the day he would try to write Sfarim or Be'in and answer all of the shailas and see hundreds of people. So it's mamish superhuman. He also had a thing, even Rabbi Yosef told him he was crazy, that he would go anywhere in Eretz Yisrael to be a sandik for a bris. Anywhere. His son said that he would go, in the morning he might be way up north, and in the afternoon all the way south. He would go anywhere in Eretz Yisrael to be a sandik. Now, Rabbi Yosef also would agree to be a sandik, but you had to come to him. Rabbi Yosef was a Mei Hasharim, so people would make a bris in his base medrash, so he would agree to be a sandik. But he was very makbid on time. He gave you like 10-minute window. So if the bris was 10 minutes late, he left, and you didn't have him. Like you said, I'll be there from 2 to 2:10. And Rabbi Yosef was very, very makbid on zman. Rav Chaim, on the other hand, had a Kabbalah, had a Messiah that he should always be open to be sandik. So how a person was able to accomplish everything he accomplished and still do all of these things is really, it's superhuman. It really shows you more of a malach than a person. Yeah.
So what are some of the Sfarim that you wrote, or things that you wrote on?
Say again?
What are some of the Sfarim that you wrote?
Yeah. So Rav Chaim wrote, Rav Chaim, interestingly enough, he wrote on things that he felt there was a need because nobody else wrote on them at all. His very first Cipher, which is a very fascinating Cipher, is on Egla Harufa. I believe to this day it is the only Sefer, other than the Rambam and Hilchos Egla Rufa, but it's the only whole Sefer on Egla Rufa. Now remember, Egla Rufa is a din, right? That if you find a corpse near a city and you don't know who killed, right? So the elders of the city bring a calf and they break the neck of the calf and they recite a vidoy that we're not responsible for the shedding of the blood. It happens to be the last parak of Saita, Mishnah and Gemara are the laws of Egla Rufa. He wrote a whole sefer. Now, of course, keep in mind that sefer was an opening to many, many topics. So, for example, when he discusses what bracha do you make on Egla Rufa, it becomes a whole discussion about which mitzvos have brachos, which mitzvos don't have brachos. So, really, he took a very narrow topic, but he used it as a springboard for many, 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 many inyanim. He wrote that when he was only 21. It's an amazing thing. I think that was his first sefer. He also wrote commentaries on the Masechtos Ketanos. I think Tainis Esther, we talked about Masechtos Ketanos. If you look after Avodah Zarah, that's where it's printed. So you will see collections of halachos that are really from the time of the Gaonim on tzitzis, tefillin, Sefer Torah, Maseches Sofrim, Maseches Gerim. Right, these are called Masechtas Ketanos. They are officially not part of Shas, and they don't have a Rashi and they don't have a Tosfos. So he wrote Perushim on the Masechtas Ketanos that people could learn. In more recent years, he has a Perush on Yerushalmi, which he didn't write, actually. The Perush Yerushalmi is Talmidim wrote from his Shiurim and the like. He wrote a Perush on a Brisa dealing with Melechas HaMishkan. And it was interesting. I noticed that all of the notices about his death called him Mechaber or Baal, and they mentioned one sefer in particular. So apparently that's considered to be the most chashuv. And this is the sefer Derech Emunah. Now what is Derech Emunah? Derech Emunah is his commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah on Seder Zeraim. Truma, Meiser, Shemitah, Bikurim, and it's written in the format of the Mishnah Brura. Just like the Mishnah Brura has three parts, right? The Mishnah Chavetz Chaim wrote three things, right? You have the Mishnah Brura, which explains the Shulchan Aruch. You have the Be'er Halacha, which is Mefalpel in different shitos. And then you have the Shar Hatzion at the bottom, which gives you references like Mara Makomos and things. So Rav Chaim did the same format. It looks like a Mishnah Brura, except it's on the Rambam, in which you have the Rambam on top, and then you have his Perush on the Rambam, and his Pilpul on the Rambam, and Mara Makomos. And that's called Derech Emunah, and it's 4 big volumes, only on Seder Zeraim, I think, and he did write, and then he began to expand it. He wrote 1 volume on Kodshim, and that's as far as he got. But apparently he was planning, if Hashem would have given him life and koach, to go weiter. So that's the Rambam. That's an absolutely indispensable for laws of Shemitah. That's like definitive work because he goes through the Rambam and all of the opinions and the like. His son said that Rav Chaim would often spend 3 whole days on just one halacha of the Rambam. And this is a person who already knew Kol HaTorah Kula. It wasn't like, we might sometimes spend 3 days because we can't figure it out. But he knew all of this already. But 3 days, how to write it, how to explain it, the different shitos, the different views, the different opinions. Right? This is how careful he was in terms of his writing. So many, 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 many svarim that he wrote. Now, what you have is you also have a tremendous secondary literature of Rav Chaim that Rav Chaim didn't write. First of all, the Yerushalmi I mentioned he didn't write. And then questions and answers, meaning people put together all of the questions I asked Rav Chaim Kanievsky. So Rav Chaim, maybe he agreed to the publication, maybe he didn't agree, but people will just give 100 questions and Rav Chaim's answers, which are typically very, very short. It's not necessarily the most illuminating thing. Like the question might be a whole paragraph, and Rav Chaim might say, Yes, no, maybe. But whatever, that's kind of the secondary. And then they have Vertlach on Chumash that he said, and now they have Rav Chaim Kanievsky on Shidduchim. But you know, maybe I forgot you guys to get. But these are not Svarim he wrote. These are like people from Shmuzin, from talks. People compile. Rav Chaim Kanievsky on the 3 weeks. You know, Guard School has like 1 million of these things. But none of them are actually, you know, his Svarim. They're just taken from talks, and Talmidim write them down. Other people write them down. Like, so I'll call that the secondary literature of Rav Chaim. But in terms of primary, what he wrote himself, there's really quite a lot that he wrote. Also, just to give you an example of the types of things he wrote off the beaten track, he wrote, we talked about this a long time ago, about the Rambam, that the Rambam says halachos, and Meforshim, like the Kesef Mishnah or the Magid Mishnah, always try to give you the makor. Where did the Rambam get it from? Gemara, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Tosefta. But there are a number of halachos of the Rambam where even the Meforshim, the great Meforshim, are not able to trace where he got it from. And sometimes the Kesef Mishnah will say, Tzorech Ian. So Rav Chaim wrote a Cipher giving a Mare Makom for those places in the Rambam where the Meforshim were not able to identify the Mare Makom. That's an extremely important Cipher, actually. It's not a huge Cipher, because the truth of the matter is there aren't that many in which the Meforshim haven't identified. But whatever, 100, whatever, something like 100, he was able to identify them. Some of them were from Midrashim that were not available, that the Rishonim didn't have, that had been lost. The Rambam had them, but between the Rambam and these Meforshim, some Midrashim had gotten lost. He was able to identify them. So that's extremely important. You know the story, this is such an amazing story. Somebody asked Rav Chaim, how many times does the word Moshe appear in the Torah? So Rav Chaim gave a number. So then somebody said, well, according to the Bar Ilan computer thing, there's 2 more than you said. You missed 2 of them. So he said right away, well, the computer is a mistake, because they counted Miseh as Moshe. Because again, Mem Shin Hey is Moshe, but it can also mean Miseh, you take from a sheep, by Korban Pesach. So he says, they counted as Moshe 2 of the mentions that are Miseh. Right? So the only one who may have rivaled Rav Chaim in our door with Bekias, knowing, was Rav Ovadia Yosef himself, who also was phenomenal. And they have a similar story to Rav Ovadia Yosef, that when Bar Ilan, they have a computer program that you can access Shelos and Tshuvos, 800 volumes. And you put in a search inquiry, like, in Hebrew, give me all the Tshuvos on life insurance, and it'll come up with things, different Tshuvos, right? It's a search tool, a useful search tool. So they came up with a certain inquiry. They came up with 15 Mara Makomos, and Rav Ovadia came up with 20. So he came up with more than the computer. So the advertisements were boasting, our program is so good that it's almost as good as Rav Ovadia Yosef. That was a boast. There were almost as many Mara Makomos as Rav Ovadia came up with. Right, so this is just hard to imagine. Yeah.
If the Rav encounters a Shaila that a week ago he would have brought to Rav Chaim, who would he go to today?
It's a very, very big issue. I mean, it depends on the nature of the Shaila, but I would, if I had a Shaila in halacha that I would not be able to figure out, I personally would go to Rav Asher Weiss. I think Rav Asher Weiss is a very, very chashuva paisek, a very, very big Talmid Chacham. I would consider him one of the Gadol Hador. I mean, he's not. I mean, I don't think it's any insult to him that he's not Rav Chaim, because nobody is Rav Chaim, but he's certainly a bar hachi to paskin the most difficult shilas that you could go to. So that's who I personally. I mean, people might have different choices. I don't want to say my choice is the choice, but that would be my personal choice. The other person I would go to, although he may not be well, Be'ez Hashem, you should have refuah shalema, is Rav David Cohen in Flatbush. Some of you might have heard of him. Rav David Cohen in Flatbush. Now, there's a Rav David Cohen in Hebron. The Shiva of Hebron is a very chashuv person, but he doesn't paskin shilos that much. But Rav David Cohen in Flatbush is a very, very chashuv paisek, and I would trust him and rely upon him. And the third person is my own Rebbe, who's the head of the Star K in Baltimore, Rav Moshe Heinemann. That's someone that I know for many, 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 many years, and one of the great poskim in America as well. But, as I say, the truth is, even Rav Chaim didn't consider himself a posek. Although he wrote so many sifrei halacha, he always said, this is not for halacha l'maisa. He said, this is not. He even had a stamp. When he would answer a tshuva, he had because since every tshuva he would say, this is not halacha l'maisa, he had a stamp that says, this is not halacha l'maisa. He would stamp it on every letter and the like. So, well, again, I mean, even though this is, I took time off the share, but again, Chazal do say, if you're mevatel and Talmud Torah, for the Levaya, certainly of a Gadol, then this is nichlal in being masbid and remembering him. I had the zechus myself to meet his father once in my life, the Stipler, who was a great, great Gadol in and of himself. But the Stipler was an interesting experience. The Stipler was the Chazon Ish's brother-in-law. The Stipler married the Chazon Ish's sister. So the Chazon Ish was Rav Chaim's uncle. Now the Chazon Ish had no children, and they lived in the same house, or the two adjoining houses. So Rav Chaim was essentially the Chazon Ish's. Rav Chaim had two fathers. He had the Stipler, and the Chazon Ish was essentially his adopted father as well. Extremely close to the Chazon Ish. But the Stipler was a great, great man, a great, great tzaddik, Bal Ruach HaKodesh. But he was almost completely deaf. And because he was very deaf, he talked very loudly, because if you don't hear your voice, so sometimes you were really scared he was screaming at you, although he was not. But so I remember so when you had to ask the Stipler anything, you had to write it down, because he couldn't hear. There's even a story why he was deaf. I'll tell you the story in a moment. So I came in. It was like I came in to see him. This was many, many years ago, and I had something written out. So he's sitting at his table in Bnei Brak, and he's drowsing. He's falling asleep a little bit. He has a table piled with svarim, piled with papers from everybody. So I'm waiting, and I wasn't going to wake him up. I'm just waiting. Then all of a sudden he wakes up with a start, and he starts screaming at me, and he says, "Why?" I'm supposed to give him an answer. He says, "Why do people bring me all of these papers? Why do they bring it to me? They should pray to Hashem. Why do they come to me? I'm a person. They should pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu." He says, then he says, "I'm an old man. I'm going to die soon." He says, I want to learn. I have to learn. And people come to me. They can come to Hashem, who can do everything. And he's yelling at me, So I say, so I nod and I give him my paper. Here's mine, to add to the pile, But actually, he was very nice. Baruch Hashem. I mean, once he did answer it, and he gave me the time. But it was very, very scary. All of a sudden, he wakes up like a lion, and starts screaming at you. So Rav Chaim had a different sheet in this way, though. The Stipler. It was interesting. The Stipler, because he was so humble, didn't like when people would build him up as this great gadol and go. And he would get, he said, "No, don't go to me." So if Sfardim would kiss his hand, he would pull it away. It really burnt at him. Rav Chaim had a different sheet. Rav Chaim didn't like it either. But Rav Chaim had the attitude, if it makes him happy, I'll let a Jew be happy. He says, I don't like it. He says, but I'm not going to make a scene about it, because it makes the person happy to kiss my hand. So I'll let him kiss my hand. It was a little bit different shita. And Rav Chaim said, he learned this. When the Chazon Ish was nifter, goes all the way back to 1953. There was a minyan in the Chazon Ish's house. There was always a minyan. So even after the Chazon Ish died, they continued the minyan. And the minhag of the minyan was, as you would expect, after davening, everybody would go and say good Shabbos to the Chazon Ish. It was a way of expressing honor. And the Shabbos, the first Shabbos after the Chazon Ish's Patira, everybody went over to the stipler to say the good Shabbos to him. And the stipler, again, because of his humility, these things upset him tremendously. He says, why are you... I mean, he didn't mind saying good Shabbos, but he said he didn't like the fact that officially everybody was walking by him. He says, why are you walking by me? He says, I'm not the Chazon Ish, I'm nothing compared to the Chazon Ish. It upset him. But Rav Chaim said later that people needed nechama, they needed comfort, they needed the idea that we have somebody. So Rav Chaim said that even though he's also uncomfortable, but he would be more open to receiving the kavod. Now this is an interesting point. This is receiving kavod l'shem shamayim. The stipler was a bayreach min hakavod legamri, and Rav Chaim had a little different hanhaga. He would be makabel the kavod, although he absolutely hated it, because he kind of said, it gives people nechama, it makes people feel good, so I'll let them give it to me. It's an interesting perspective, an interesting machlokes between father and son in terms of how you take this. Now that's very different than the person who likes the kavod, right? That's treif. But both of them were borech min hakavod, but the stipler refused to take it, and Rav Chaim would take it if it would help people have chizuk or whatever it is. So that was an interesting mahalach and the like. But yeah.
Did the Rav have any personal encounters with Rav Chaim?
Very, very sporadic. I wish I would have had more. I mean, the only encounter I had was with JLE, go to Rav Chaim. Rav Chaim would give them a little test on whatever chumash or something that they learned, like, how many days did Hashem make the world or something, the bracha is, of course, a wonderful thing, but, by the time I got to know Rav Chaim, you couldn't know Rav Chaim well, meaning if you go back 30, 40, 50 years ago, a person could go to Rav Chaim and spend, an hour, talking and learning with him or whatever it would be. But by the last years, it wasn't shaykh anymore. Rabbi Yosef was the same way. People tell me they remember just going into Rabbi Yosef in a base medrash and, not that he would give you all the time in the world, he was very much, but you could talk to him, you could ask him questions, follow up. But by the last years, you were given like 1 minute, and that was it. I remember I had to ask Rabbi Yosef a shaila once. Actually, it was an interesting shaila. I'll tell you the shaila, actually. This is when I was a rabbin in Silver Spring, and this was a shaila, which is a very common shaila, l'maisa. It's a very important shaila, and a very common shaila. Some of you might face it yourself, in which, let's imagine that you're a child born of a mother who was married before. So you're born from a second marriage. But your mother did not get a get from her first marriage, although she got a civil divorce. Now, in the eyes of halacha, a woman that didn't get a get is still married to her first husband. That means if you're born from the second husband, you're born from adultery. Now, if you're born from adultery, that's very serious. That makes you a mamzer. Now, a mamzer is a Jew. Don't get me wrong. A mamzer is a yid. A mamzer counts for a minyan. But a mamzer has very severe disabilities in terms of who can a mamzer marry. Right? A mamzer can marry a mamzeris or a gioris. And in either case, the kid's going to be a mamzer in perpetuity. Now, nobody intended anything bad here, but if you weren't religious, you didn't care. There was a civil divorce. Who needs a get, etc. But when the kid becomes a Baal Tshuva 20 years later, all of a sudden he discovers he might be a mamzer. Very, very serious question. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, all the way back in the 1960s, gave us the yesod of the heter that we use, and that is, hey, you only need a get if the kedushin was a kosher kedushin. If the marriage was not a valid marriage, you don't need a get. Now, what makes a marriage kosher? It's not the Masader Kedushin per se, it's are there kosher witnesses who are Shomer Shabbos. Now, many marriages under conservative or reform auspices the Eidim are not Shomer Shabbos. So Rav Moshe said, if marriage number one was not kosher to begin with, marriage number one didn't need a get. And if marriage number one didn't need a get, then marriage number two was not adultery, and therefore the kid is not a mamzer. Now, you may ask a kasha, but wait a second. Maybe just like marriage number one was not a kosher marriage, maybe marriage number two was not a kosher marriage if they weren't religious. But that's not a problem. Because even if your parents' marriage is not a kosher marriage, at most that means you're born out of wedlock. This is very important. Being born out of wedlock does not make you a mamzer. Be sure you understand that. If a man and a woman are not halachically married, and they have a kid, that kid has no halachic disability at all. Mamzer comes from adultery. It does not come from out of wedlock intercourse. So yeah, so maybe mom and dad aren't married. Maybe. But so what? That doesn't affect me. But if my mother was married to her first husband and didn't have a get, that would make me a mamzer. So Rav Moshe's psak liberated, you can't imagine how important this is in the Baal Tshuva world. It liberates the vast majority of these situations from mamzer. So I had to ask Rav Elyashiv a shayla along those lines about a boy that was born from a second marriage, and mom did not get a get from her first marriage. But the problem was we didn't have proof. This was a little more complicated. We didn't have proof if the first marriage was kosher or not kosher. And the first marriage was like 1952, so it was a while ago. But we had circumstantial evidence. Because the chazan who did it, the rabbi said that the chazan who officiated, who was Shomer Shabbos, but no Shomer Shabbos people ever went with him. Whatever. It was like a circumstantial hearsay type of thing. And I'm waiting in line, and I asked Rav Elyashiv the shayla, and he told me that it's okay. And then I had a second question to ask him about the same thing. And they pushed me. It was like an assembly line. Said, "Oh, one question per person." Yep. So my connection with Rav Elyashiv was also only one shayla, and Rav Chaim was kind of the same way. But in earlier years, there was much more of an opportunity to get to talk. This is the problem. When you have a great Gadol, there's a lot of demand. A lot of demand on his time. So as a result, we don't get all the time that we would like. Yeah.
There was someone about him who said first there's like a chiyuv to go to Levaya, and also there might even be a chiyuv like Kriya, maybe from Bracha.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Let's take the first question. Is there a chiyuv to go to the Levaya? So once again, on one hand, we do have a Gemara in Megillah that says we are mevatel Torah for Hotzas Hameis, and that's not even talking about a Gadol. And for a Gadol, no matter what the number is, even if it's all of Klal Yisrael. So that would indicate there's a chiyuv to go. On the other hand, there's the nitziv, a very, very interesting nitziv that you need to know. The nitziv says the chiyuv to be mevatel Talmud Torah, to go to a Levaya, means if the mace is being taken right by me. Let's say I'm sitting in a base medrash. I mean, the way we're configured, it's not even possible. But let's assume you have a base medrash that's facing the street, and a Levaya is going out. You are mechuyev to leave the base medrash and escort the mace 4 amos. That's not too much. Leave and escort the mace. But the Nitziv says there actually is no chiyuv to go out of town for a Levaya, even for a Gadol. That's an amazing Nitziv. That the whole Gemara of Mevatlin Talmud Torah, L'hotzas hames, is only if the mess is mamish in front of you. In fact, there's not even a chiyuv within you. According to the Nitziv, if something's going on in Har HaZeisim, I'm not mechuyev to leave or sameach. Now, should you follow the Nitziv? Should you not follow the Nitziv? That already is a machlokas. Different people will say different things. So I don't want to give you a psak on this, but there is absolutely a makam in halacha that you're not mechuyev to go. And the truth is, I suspect a little bit, maybe it's my own biases, that had Rav Chaim been asked, should I learn at Seder or should I go to his own Levaya, I think he would have advised you that it's a bigger zechus even for him, for you to sit and learn. But who knows? I can't say I know that for sure. But be aware of the nitziv, which is a very important thing. Now, in terms of ripping kriya, so again, the Gemara says, when the Nasi died, the head of the Sanhedrin, everybody had to rip kriya. So the question becomes, some will apply that to Gadol Hador as well. So there's certainly a makam to rip kriya, but again, we're not nayig to treat it as a chiyuv unless you were mamish a talmid. Yeah.
Does that mean once you left for the Levaya, the field wasn't in place, meaning there's no hedge should be missing the learning, but once you get there and see the hearse or something, that's when the field's in place and that's when it's okay? Yes. Once you're by the hearse, then you are malavet and you're machabed it and the like, yeah.
The Rav was going to mention how the stipler went deaf in 1 year.
Oh yeah. So let me end with this story. I guess today is story day, but again, I think this is nichlal in Hesped. The story goes that the stipler was actually drafted in the Russian army in the early. This is already shortly after the Russian Revolution. I think it was during World War I, and he was put on guard duty, and in the middle of the night, and there was a heavy coat that was hung on a tree that when you would relieve the guard, you would put on this heavy coat. Because there was only one coat. Now the stipler would not take something off a tree on Shabbos because you're not allowed to be mishtamesh with an elam. So as a result, he did not take off the coat, and he was debating because maybe it's a sakana, but he said, I can hold out for another minute. And the story goes, also he didn't wear a hat, he didn't wear a coat. So it says that the extreme cold gave him an ear infection that resulted in his deafness, and this is because he didn't want to violate drabanan of Shabbos, of taking something off a tree on Shabbos. Say again?
If he knew that he would lose his hearing, would he be able to?
So that's an interesting question. Again, technically, it's only pikuach nefesh that would allow, but this is muktzah really. This is not an issur d'oraisa. So if he knew it would cause deafness, he would be allowed to take it off because this is not a malacha d'oraisa in any event. But he used to say that, Baruch Hashem, if he lost his hearing, Baruch Hashem, he did it because he wanted to be meticulous in Shmira Shabbos. They say another thing about Shatness, too. They have a story that he was learning in a base medrash, and all of a sudden somebody said that certain clothing might be Shatness, and they should get it checked. So immediately, he didn't even, he was wearing one of the questionable things. He just ripped out the line, and he just sat there. He didn't want to stop learning, so he just ripped up his clothes right there. Because of Shatness. So he was a big Yarichet. Oh, one other story about Shatness of the stipler. The Chazon Ish made the shidduch with his sister Miriam. Rebbetzin Kanievsky, his name. Rav Chaim's mother was Miriam. So the Chazon Ish picked the stipler to be the chassan for his sister. So after they have a pagisha, they have a first date, whatever. I'm sure they didn't go to a movie or anything, but they meet. So the Chazon Ish asks his sister, "How did you find him?" So she says, I don't know. He comes in and he falls asleep. As soon as he sits at the table, he falls asleep. So, what am I supposed to think? So the Chazon Ish calls the stipler, who was a single bacher, and says, you don't fall asleep. You meet someone that's supposed to be your mishudechas. You don't fall asleep. So the stipler says, I feel really, really bad. What happened was, apparently he had to take like a 30-hour train ride from wherever he was coming, really far away. And there were no seats in coach, so he was bumped to first class. European trains, even today, have very fancy first class apartments or compartments, and the seating has upholstery. And the stipler thought that the upholstery was Shatness, may have been Shatness. Now, the stipler figured, I have 30 hours, I'm going to sleep. So the stipler stayed up like 30 hours before to learn. And he figured I have plenty of time on the train to sleep. But when he gets upgraded to first class, he refused to sit down because maybe the upholstery was Shatness. So he says, so I had to stand up for 30 hours, not sleeping for 30 hours. So it was like 60 hours. I didn't sleep. So when I finally sat down on a chair, I just fell asleep. He says, I couldn't help it. So that's why. So Baruch Hashem, the shidduch did work out. Yeah.
How does sitting on a chair made of Shatness violate Shatness? It's not wearing it.
Yeah, so the reason is this. The reason is that when it's soft fabric, the soft fabric bunches up a little bit, and if it can go over your leg a tiny bit, so that's considered, again, it's Shatness D'Rabbanan. That is called levisha, meaning if it's hard fabric that doesn't bunch up, it's actually mutter. It's actually mutter. But if it's soft fabric, so it crunches up, and that's called midrabanan, that is called wearing Shatness. Okay, stop here and be well.